I'll tell you a personal story about some shoes. So when I was 16, 17, I'd like burnt through my shoes. I wore them everywhere and I had a hole in them. I came down the next day and my mum had them in a bag and she'd taken them to the cobblers and she'd resold them. And for me, I didn't even think about that was a possibility. I didn't know where those shoes were made. Probably not in this country. I didn't know where they were going when I chucked them away. Probably also not this country. But what my mum had done is invested in a local skill and given my shoes a new lease of life. And it changed the way I thought about everything.
Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast exploring how to balance profit with purpose in an increasingly complex world. I'm Charlie Martin, your host and founder of TrueMark. And our article this week is titled "The Future of the Built Environment is the Circular Economy," which argues that cutting carbon in construction is less about eye-catching reuse projects and more about rebuilding the systems, incentives, and supply chains that make circular design the default rather than the exception. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that today an absolute expert is joining me in the space, Amira Damji, Chartered Structural Engineer and Director of Additive Sustainability. Amira, it's absolutely brilliant to have you on the show this morning. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Thank you, Charlie. It's good to be here.
Now, before all of our listeners and viewers dive over onto LinkedIn and just try and find you and have a good old deep dive into your LinkedIn profile, let's save them the clicks and let's just give a little bit more meat on the bones, if possible, around your current work and focus with additive sustainability.
Yeah, thanks. So I am a structural engineer by background, and the entire aim of Additive, what I set it up to do was to really get that kind of technical structural thinking that you normally get at the end of your project or when you put together your design team, and kind of take that to the early stage planning of what you're trying to do. So it's really putting a materials and asset maintenance focus at the beginning so you can better strategize the lifespan of your asset or building. And what I think is really important is that I think that thinking is really important because circular economy, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, is a huge focus now. So we can't think of things in the same way. All of us need to be integrated in the earlier strategic planning decisions about our asset, and we have to accept that we have responsibility of it together. So it's trying to introduce that kind of collaboration into the way that construction works.
And that was beautifully described, Amira. And I'm sure for those that are jumping onto the Additive website, which we'll be linking to, will be understanding things in kind of a fuller way off the back of what you've just said. But just for the I'm going to ask some very, very simple and possibly naive questions here. But just talk us through from a structural engineering perspective. You mentioned asset and building. Just what do we mean by asset?
Well, we do mean a building or a piece of infrastructure, something that someone is using or experiencing or living in. Why I like to talk about that as an asset is because I want people to think in that way. It's something that provides future value. It's something that you need to maintain. It's something that you need to respect. And it's something that provides your stakeholders, who are the people interacting with your building, value. So that's why instead of circular economy, I like to talk about asset maintenance. How can we make this thing last longer? How can we improve the quality of it through time and the experience of the people that are interacting with it?
I love that. I mean, very much in our wheelhouse around communication and language, etc. I love the idea of describing it in that way. It seems so much more pragmatic and realistic within the kind of commercial world that we operate in. I imagine that that sort of language is landing particularly well with prospective clients of yours. Let me ask you though, I just want to again play my absolute kind of simple-minded task of putting everything together here. But what you described before is that when it comes to the development of these assets, the traditional approach has been to consider the kind of material considerations at the very end of the project cycle. You've ultimately worked out what you're going to build, like how it's going to work, etc.
So it's not entirely that simple. I may have oversimplified it. We definitely do think about the materials that we're going to use probably once we've decided what we're going to build. But I think there's a piece where we need to think more about what's already there in terms of what material components exist, maybe somewhere else in another building that we could use, or what assets, buildings, do we currently have available that we can make the most use of. So can we give what we already have a better life and improve it rather than deciding we have a blank sheet? I think we have this attitude that like every new project is kind of a blank canvas, when that's not really, at least in this country, the case. We have a lot of existing infrastructure that has a lot of capacity still, and we need to have a cultural shift in how we look at respecting that and using the best of what was already available before we start saying, yeah, we want to do this and these are all the materials that we're going to use to do it.
Just for full context, like give us an example of a client. Are we talking sort of, a local authority thinking about all of the different assets that they have available to them, thinking about which buildings perhaps has some materials that could be reused or et cetera within a new project? Is that the sort of thing that we're describing here?
Kind of, yeah. No, you've got it. So I can give an example that's not on an additive project, but a project I had worked on in the past.
Perfect.
And we were redeveloping it. The project was known as a redevelopment. There was a lot of new housing, offices, and kind of infrastructure that would meet the needs of the local community. But what we found actually when we were digging into literally spades in the ground was that there were actually some piles that were supporting an old bridge that was no longer in use. And instead of taking those down, because they were within our site boundary, so our default position would be, yes, let's get rid of that and build what we want to in the space that it was. But what we decided to do was incorporate it as a historical feature as part of the design of the new structure. And this was like a curved piled wall. And what we decided to do was to say, okay, can we turn this into like a curved staircase or something? Now, the issue here was that we would be losing commercial space. So we had to make the argument that, this added value we could either get from somewhere else in this really massive project, or, just pitch that this is a part of the Victorian history of the infrastructure that exists in this area, and it should become part of our future solution.
I get it. Okay, that's given me some real clarity around the approach, and it's that kind of, as you say, it's that creative thinking, if you like, around what's there already and what value can be sustained, if you like, through incorporating or protecting or reusing some of the elements of the assets that are already there. And I can see that.
I think we have a very strong history of construction in this country, and the assets that were built in, 100 odd years ago are still, quality assets. They are still strong. And I'm trying to improve kind of our understanding of how they work and our confidence that actually this probably could last another 100 years. I'm going to show you how to do it.
I love that. What better way to build sustainable buildings than to build buildings that people really love and appreciate in terms of their aesthetic? So is there part of that comes into your thinking as well? Not only the quality of the construction in terms of its, potential sort of long-term resilience, but actually the aesthetic and how we can start really appreciating our buildings again. Is that something that factors in for you?
You make a really interesting point, Charlie, and I've thought on it over and over again, and I'm going to do it now, and I don't have any conclusions. So hopefully you can, your experience will help to develop this. But it's, what do we perceive as valuable? Like now, if I had a carpenter to make a bespoke table for me from scratch, even though it takes longer and it would cost me a lot more, the kind of artistry or that skill or that craft I perceive as valuable. And at some point we perceived, being able to, because of societal need, build things quickly and in a modular way as valuable. And it's about kind of understanding, what do we perceive as valuable? So why is something old versus vintage? Why is something heritage, versus worn? How are we as a collective society assigning value to something historic?
It's a brilliant observation, that. And as you say, there at times, I suppose, when you immediately think about the use of those terms, there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason. It's just perspective. It's not a collective norm, if you like. It is literally down to your impression of things. Do you think our mindsets are shifting in the modern world?
I could go on about this because it's one of my favorite things to talk about, but I think there's so many elements that feature here. So one of them is we're getting more environmentally conscious and we're getting more environmentally accountable. So I think there's probably a more regulatory or like technical push towards reuse, recycling, things like that. And that's, I think, the lights coming through, we're able to see the value in something old because we're seeing the damage that new things do.
Yeah.
I think it is definitely changing, but I think something that we need to attack as a built environment community and a community of professionals who have particular types of training is that we need to make life affordable for people. And while we may have the choice to be able to opt for something that is more expensive and has this kind of more ecological and circular value, other people necessarily, or most people probably do not have that choice. So I think we should try and develop ways that make that choice not purely an economic option or necessity.
And I love the fact that you've brought that up, because I think that is literally something that I wanted to query with you that relates to the article that we're going to be discussing today, which perfectly segues us into that part of our conversation, Amira. So if possible, before I come into you with that question, would you mind just introducing and summarizing the article for our listeners and viewers, and then perhaps just picking out from it whatever you found to be most interesting?
Okay, yes, thank you so much. It was a really interesting piece. So the title of the article is "The Future of the Built Environment is Circular Economy." And there is a discussion which I think a lot of built environment professionals will agree on, is that we need to move towards a circular economy. So when we're thinking about procuring material, we need to be thinking more about where those materials are coming from and whether partially some of those materials can be reclaimed from waste, essentially. It's a really interesting piece because it also talks about things that we've just mentioned. So maintenance strategies and repair and, companies coming back and reclaiming old building parts and seeing if they can reuse them and fit them back in. It also talks about the need of policy to incentivize this practice because it's working differently to the way that we've currently developed very efficient ways of working. And it refers to some legislation in the EU which talks about potentially tax incentives or adjustments in pricing and kind of border controls, which will allow us to be more accountable for the waste that we produce, i.e. not ship it off to another country to get sorted. That example was about plastics and textiles and things like this. And also about injections of cash, which basically will allow recycled products to be competitive on the market with virgin products. Because often there's kind of a price difference and most people would opt for the cheaper one.
I think it's a fairly optimistic piece, really, about, the potential for circularity in the built environment and kind of a call to arms to say, look, this is what could happen and the impact and the implications of it if we get this stuff right. But it does bring you back to, and you've alluded to it again there, but it brings you back to the point at the end of our last bit of our conversation around, why isn't this happening? Like, the case is strong, like, but in the article, it talks about the amount of investment upfront from an infrastructural perspective that would be required in order to facilitate or unlock, if you like, the value that I think it was like 1.5 trillion pounds worth of value that is suggested could be unlocked by, was it 2050? But obviously it was the question of, but there's a bit of upfront pain associated with the cost of the infrastructure and also making the products that are available in circular system comparable in price to the virgin projects that you products that you've alluded to. Is it just as simple as kind of tweaking regulation and legislation in order to create these new conditions to prioritize those materials, or is there something else at play?
I think there's lots of things at play. Like, I do appreciate where the article is coming from, and I do agree that the circular economy is something that we need to really be pushing towards in the next few years. But I think it kind of misses out some, infrastructure and construction related points at least. And I think that one of those is about making the best use of what we already have. So we've got a lot of infrastructure, we've alluded to it already, but making use of that first in order to minimize that extra carbon that we are using when we procure new material. Yes, we have a choice of, can we buy something completely new? Can we buy something with some recycled material in it? Those are both still buying new things. You're still introducing carbon into the atmosphere, right? These are mitigatory, like, at best. You need to be making best use of what you already have and investing in the knowledge about how to do the best with that. Is
it too simple to suggest that when considering that point that you've just made, the business models of the organizations operating within the built environment currently are so, as you've described, so efficient, so ingrained, so sort of normalized, if you like, in terms of this is how our business works and how it makes money, that what you're describing doesn't just require a change of knowledge and understanding and appreciation. It requires a fundamental change of the business models of the organizations at play. And that feels like a really, really big thing for these organizations that have built themselves into successful commercial entities over, potentially centuries. Is that what makes it so difficult to get organizations thinking differently?
Charlie, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I'll tell you a personal story about some shoes. So when I was 16, 17, I'd burnt through my shoes. I wore them everywhere and I had a hole in them. And I kept them downstairs just, to chuck them in the bin. And I'd almost already ordered another pair of the exact same thing. I came down the next day and my mum had them in a bag and she'd taken them to the cobblers and she'd resold them. And for me, I didn't even think about that was a possibility. I didn't know where those shoes were made, probably not in this country. I didn't know where they were going when I chucked them away, probably also not this country. But what my mum had done is invested in a local skill and given my shoes a new lease of life. And it changed the way I thought about everything. And I think, it's not exactly a parallel to what we're talking about, but I do think the cultural shift is a real sticking point that we're going to have to change. We cannot work in the same way that we were assuming we could work before. And so, especially in construction, everyone has their role. The design team does this, and then the construction delivery team does this, and then the maintenance and repair people, if they even exist. I've not really worked on a project where we are looking at maintenance and repair. You just say this material does this for this long, and then someone's going to have to figure out how to repair it, right? We actually are all responsible. When it comes to a circular economy, we are all working together and we are all responsible for this thing. And we have to come together in order to make that happen. The person demolishing a building has to do it in a specific way in order to make the best out of the material that they're taking out so it can be used somewhere else. And they have to liaise with me to do that. But the way that we work is someone's contract ends and someone's contract begins. Someone else's contract ends, someone's contract begins. We can't work like that anymore.
When you think about C-suite within the built environment sector, the most significant tier one contractors, etc., material providers that are at play, property developers. How prevalent is the sort of acute understanding of circular economy principles within C-suite in the built environment? Do you think that's something, because what you're describing there, to me, those silos exist in these organizations, those departments exist. What we really need is we need the leadership within these organizations to fundamentally understand exactly what you've just described, so they can start influencing these Goliaths, if you like, that they're managing, in order to reframe and repurpose, in a way, the way that these departments operate in order to adopt circular principles. Of your experience, like, how prevalent is the understanding and knowledge around this stuff?
You know what? It's, again, really interesting. That's why I love having these conversations. But I think actually the bigger players are doing it better. And I think they're doing it better because they have to. So they're paying for the right knowledge. They've got sustainability teams. They're doing the right thinking. They've got the resources to put it together, right? I think it's like the majority of the industry that don't have access to all of this, that are unable to do it even if they try.
Why are they unable to do it even if they know what they need to do?
In that scenario, I think you struggle if your leadership and your client base is not invested in the kind of circular economy sustainable practice. So if you have a really big contract, you might be legally mandated to get or some regulation that will improve the value of your assets that you're building if you fulfill XYZ sustainability criteria. And those are requirements for big projects. That's why these things get done. But I think if you're just, a small engineering company or a small architecture firm, it's really hard to push against what your client's contract is telling you to do. So there needs to be a cultural shift in kind of that clientele.
I'm with you. So it would be fair to say that the kind of cascading down, if you like, from the largest players within the built environment sector to all other kind of tiers, if you like, of organization at play, down to the kind of SME level, that's what we need to encourage more of. We need to encourage greater understanding and adoption as things cascade down.
Yeah.
When you look at the opportunity for this, like when you think about like the future of, a truly circular set of principles, if you like, that underpin the built environment sector, I know the article alludes to this, but just talk us through, like, what does that mean? What does that look like? Like, what are the implications of that more broadly?
Oh, interesting. I guess for me, we should start as designers or as people that are looking to build things. We should be asking ourselves what is already available. So rather than like, I need this and I'm going to find the best case thing that already exists that fits kind of what I'm looking to build, we should be looking at what we have available as a starting point. Like, what can I build from this, essentially? Like, I have these pieces of rubbish. What can I make from it? Not rubbish, but, reused, waste or something reclaimed. In fact, we already talked about value attribution and how we use those words. So actually, rubbish is probably the wrong word to be using there. But something that's already there and available, we should use that as a starting point, as our pieces, our components to what we're trying to build. I think also there needs to be some kind of engagement between the people that design things and build them and the people that they're building for. I think perhaps maybe architects have more experience with this because they conduct a lot of outreach and community engagement. But it's the things that we build inevitably serve the community, society, people that live in them, people that experience them. We have an issue at the moment where people don't want to upgrade their homes for energy efficiency and retrofit because they perceive it to be too expensive. They potentially, they've even tried. They've put their own money into it. They've tried and they don't necessarily see the benefits. And we need to really hold ourselves to account as the built environment to really say, like, okay, how do we incentivize people to do this by improving their quality of life, and not one that they see in like 20, 30 years, ones that are proving beneficial now. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying that we need to engage on that basis better, because we can all agree as a built environment industry and professionals on a particular kind of agenda. But if it's not serving the people that are living in it, then we can't collectively as a society push towards something better.
What are the implications of that? Do I live? Are the buildings essentially healthier spaces to be in? Are they obviously long-term, less kind of environmentally impactful? But again, for me as an individual who's, got a family and is concerned about, paying the rent, paying the mortgage, and to be fair, probably the biggest driver for me is going to be the health and well-being of my family. What are the other implications of living in a building, or experiencing a building, working in a building, that have utilized kind of circular principles?
The thing is, everyone does it in a different way. So it really depends on what type of building you get. And honestly, I don't think this is my area of expertise. But what I would say is that there are not necessarily any contradictions between living in a circular building and living in a building that is healthy. We just need to make sure that, we don't want just only the very wealthiest people to be able to afford somewhere that is healthy, right? So we need to be able to kind of develop a circular economy. And I don't have the answers as to how, but we need to develop one that's affordable.
Well, and you described earlier, how that whole maintenance and kind of, I guess sort of sweating the asset, if you like, for as long as you possibly can is part of this thinking. Presumably when it comes to the cost element for me as a homeowner, etc., that's got to be a core part of it, to try and present the built in this way. Ultimately, it's about trying to give me as much value over as long a period of time as possible. And ultimately, these principles provide that. So it's almost like getting that pitch into my hands to say, from a financial perspective, this is a sustainable way of engaging in property purchase. Is that the kind of thinking we need to?
I definitely think you're right. Yeah, I think if there was kind of a maintenance strategy and a lifetime strategy up front when someone is deciding that this is somewhere that they want to live. I've heard kind of, just not in my professional experience, but more in my personal life, kind of issues where people have bought homes and they're really struggling in some seasons to keep the house warm or cold, or even you get some damage when you have extreme weather events. We're going to have more and more of those. So I think, as you say, it would be really helpful to kind of have the input right at the beginning of this is the quality that you're going to expect. This is what we expect to deteriorate over time that will need maintaining. And these are, how we're going to protect you against weather events and issues that might affect the quality of the thing that you're living in. That stuff is climate resilience. And we need to be having honest conversations about how we're doing that.
I'm now talking very personally here, but when I read this article and when I speak to somebody like yourself, and, the business case for circular seems strong, but it seems like it's something that it requires that longer term view. It requires, there's going to be a bit of pain up front in terms of the investments that are required and the change of thinking that we've already alluded to in terms of models, etc. But it's okay because there's this big golden nugget that's sitting at the end of of doing this work. But I have conversations all the time with people where we talk about short-termism in our politics, short-termism in our commercial world, etc. And the reality is that for those organizations that are beholden to shareholder value maximization, they're not thinking, circular looks like a good bet long term. They're thinking, well, no, building stuff that ultimately doesn't necessarily need to last, but ultimately just allows us to build more and more of this stuff and sell and realize those short-term quarterly objectives. That's ultimately the game that we're playing collectively, and therefore that's the attraction. please, of all that what I've just thrown at you in terms of personal perspective on this, like, tell me that I'm wrong. Tell me that I'm being overly cynical in my view of how the sort of capitalist framework applies to the built environment.
Unfortunately, I have to largely agree with what you said. However, I do think that we shouldn't just say like a circular approach or a low embodied carbon approach. I think when we're talking about resilience and we're talking about looking towards the future and we're talking about providing for people, these approaches have to be used in tandem. And I think what a lot of people in the sustainability space are doing is literally like small pieces of each thing where they are commercially viable. So for example, if your recycled option is extremely more expensive than your non-recycled option, okay, where can we get that material back? Can we use less? Can we use it more efficiently? Are we over specifying somewhere? So like, it's a really tough ask to kind of push the boulder up the hill to say, we have to work against this kind of big cost parameter, which is driving everything. Unfortunately, it is. And that's where the role of kind of government regulation, investment comes in. And there are lots of different ways of acquiring that investment. It doesn't necessarily have to come for your client. For example, people are developing new technologies, and that you know, the investment for that comes from a lot of different spaces. Also, you have companies that are developing kind of a circular product in tandem with a non-circular product or virgin product. And what they'll do is they'll take the profits from that and invest it into the development of their circular product, right? So everyone's using basically whatever market mechanisms they have to kind of really push this sustainability agenda, this resilience agenda. And at some point, we are going to have to use everything we can to develop a system which works in a more circular way. Saying that though, yeah, the cost thing is the big barrier. And we need to incentivize we either need to make the circular option the cheapest option, or we need to set contractual kind of punishments or incentives. I think incentives work better within the way that everything works. So there are lots of contracts in a construction project. We need to incentivize the use of circular and more sustainable practices as a standard. Because if it's an option, people aren't going to do it. So yeah, we all have a role to play here. And that's why we can't rely only on big government doing some type of VAT reduction. They should reduce VAT for reclaimed materials. That's something that a lot of groups are pushing for right now. It's not going to solve our entire problem. It's a very complex problem. We all need to be pushing against it as much as possible.
And I think I love the fact that you've sort of swung this around to a positive but pragmatic view of the challenge that's at play, and ultimately how you've described that there are just many, many levers that we've got to all be pulling in order to ultimately get us to where we need to get to. But it does bring me back to a really core and central theme of our conversation today, which is it's that awareness of the issues and awareness of the possible solutions. And as a result of that awareness, the ability to be able to critically think and ask the right questions. You've kept, during this conversation, Amira, asking really interesting questions. The questions about, okay, we've done it like that, but what is the opportunity to do it differently, especially in light of what we already have available to us over here? That sort of thinking, that sort of awareness, I think seems to me to be almost the biggest lever at play. We need everybody, whether or not it's regulators, whether or not it's product manufacturers, developers of buildings, structural engineers, architects, etc. We need everybody having these kind of considerations in mind. And if we all have that collectively, we can all start pulling our individual levers and moving ourselves collectively towards the outcome that we're trying to achieve. But that's what I've taken from our conversation today. Any comment on that before I give you a magic wand?
Yeah, definitely. I think you've summarized it really well. It's a massive problem, but that collaborative discourse does lead to innovation. And innovation is not necessarily a product. It's also a different way of doing the same thing. And because in construction, we're used to doing things in a certain way, there's this kind of idea of this is the way that we've always done it. And it might not even be the way that we've always done it. It's the way that we've always done it for the last 10 years, 20 years, maybe. When I think of my shoe example, I realize how time is perceived differently by different people. But anyway, to change something small and learn from it and collect the data on it, that's where we can find patterns to say, okay, this approach works. And then we need to share that pattern with other people so that everyone can do it a little bit. It might not be, if every building saved 20% of its carbon, that's better than having one really good structural engineer or really good design team that has a carbon neutral building.
Here. You get doubled here, Amira. That was brilliant. Right. Now, I'm fascinated to see what you're going to do with this, because we've kind of touched upon throughout the conversation, some, what ifs, if you like, in terms of how the built environment could evolve. But I'm fascinated to see what you're going to do with this. If I was to hand you a magic wand, Amira, and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I think I would probably assign responsibility to the entire life cycle, to attribute it to the people that work on it. So for example, I think that I should still be responsible for the maintenance of buildings that I designed 5 years ago. I can't just leave it it's now someone else's problem. I give them all the drawings, I hand it over to them, and they just contact me if they, need that drawing again. If we're working in a circular way, we all need to be jointly responsible for things. Once it's not your responsibility anymore, it doesn't really matter what you've done with it up until that point, as long as you deliver it to the standard you need to deliver it to. I don't think that's good enough. So that shared ownership, shared responsibility also encourages us to collaborate together, because we want win-win situations. So I think the magic wand, I would say, is we all have responsibility of what we use at the end of life. Sorry, not the user, but the producer. We have responsibility of the end of life.
Collective and continuous accountability. I love
absolutely.
That. I love that. That's a brilliant suggestion. Amira, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning. That has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you giving up some of your time.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And thank you for adding to that conversation and improving my perspective on the way that, that what I do impacts other people. I think that dialogue is super, super important. So I'm really, really glad that we had that.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A massive thank you to Amira Damji for joining me on today's show. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trusted communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.